Hi, my name's Michael, and I will be presenting today how you can use FME to create an NBA Fantasy Draftboard. So I am the business development consultant here at One Spatial, just in sales, as some of you may already know. So just if you're a bit of a novice to this sort of stuff, what NBA Fantasy Sports is basically is players, so just people take on the role of the general manager and select a sporting team of real players, and the players that you choose are based off their statistical output of their sport. So and then that statistical output will have some sort of value, which is all added up and computed by the fantasy program, and that will generate your team performance. And it was popularized in the 90s. It was a lot of people used to do it kind of off the books and manually, but with the internet, it's exploded a lot in its access. So a good example of this is, say, you're watching back in the day when it was Trent Barrett was playing for the Dragons. So maybe he scored 2 tries, he got 2 try assists, and he made 20 tackles that day. So if you looked off a scoring structure like this, he would have had 50 points. But say if they're versing the Sharks, and on the other side, Brett Kamali throws 2 intercepts, he only makes 3 tackles and has a try assist. Based on that particular point structure, he would only get 4 points from the game. So someone with Trent Barrett would do a whole lot better than someone that had Brett Kamali. So fantasy sports is actually a really big industry. It's worth over 22 billion US, which is still growing. So I guess further analysis and it is come about, and it does get pretty serious. So what makes it, why is there so much money in fantasy sports? So it's quite popular amongst friends and people who are really into their sport, because you can essentially test your knowledge against against your friends. There's money to be won in particular competitions that will put in an entry money. And just an analysis I thought is that from experience, you're checking your fantasy team every day. There's constant updates, so there's probably some sort of dopamine-based model going on there that's made it quite popular as well. So there's the 2 formats, because there's quite a few formats of fantasy, and the 2 I'll be presenting on today is a points format. So basically, as I was saying before, your stat earns or loses you points based on what it was, and just whoever has the most points across their team wins. Pretty straightforward. And then the other one is a category format. So you basically have to, amongst your team, get the highest amount of stats in the category. So that might be tries scored, tries assisted, tackles, if we're using the example before, and whoever wins the most categories wins. So it's just a little bit different in how you go about it. So what makes winning hard in fantasy sports? You need to know who the best performing, or knowing who that's going to be for the year is quite a challenge, because there are people that are declining as they get older, or some people are getting better as they're not so young. How often does a person get used within their team, because they can not be the greatest player, but if they've got no real positional depth, then they might get used a lot and they might be undervalued. And particularly when it comes to particular formats like category leagues, do I have the right balance across my team, as opposed to points where it's just I need to get whoever contributes the most. And also when you're drafting, everyone has the access to the exact same draft board, so there's no real, you haven't got yourself a leg up, or everyone's got access to the same information. So what is a draft board? What exactly am I talking about? It's basically a spreadsheet of every player available from every team that you want to pick, and the draft board that you're given usually is a projected draft board about their stats for the upcoming year. So it's all prediction. It's not actually on their performance from previous years, and the stats that they're provided is basically the points that they're going to that will contribute to the overall performance of each game. And this is across, the draft board is across points, leagues, and legacy formats. So there's a few others as well. So the draft board that they give on the draft day is handy, but there is better, and I think there's better analysis out there that you can base on previous years, whether it's actual, it's tangible. It's not just you're at the mercy of what some analyst thinks, and there's other statistics out there that contributes to identifying value in a player that they just don't give you. So the solution to this is basically you've got a lack of extensive stats. We've got FME that's going to come in and produce the draft board from last year. And the solution is money won, bragging rights, and competition, sports and all that stuff. So this is the workspace that I came up with. So it's a bit hard to read. Obviously trying to fit it into here, but basically I've broken it up into a few sections that I'll go through. So the first section is the first part where you're just combining a lot of different data sets that have what you want, cleaning that up as well. So there's also we've got to bring in the missing players from last year that aren't included in the analysis. So your rookies and your injured players. Then there's creating the stats for those players because it was missing from the stat sheets that I had to bring them in. Then it's creating the two leagues and the two analysis, so your category and your points league. And then I made this extra step because I wanted to basically create analysis between the two leagues and combine them into a spreadsheet. And then that's the last part, is basically bringing it all together and putting them into the spreadsheets that I have, or the draft boards. So the first one here is bringing in the data sets. So we've got the 3 spreadsheets that I've just sourced from the internet that I found were pretty good. Apologies about the clarity on this. It's just screenshotting it and trying to use a screen for FME is not always in production's mind, I guess. So then we basically, from here, it goes through, you can see the different feature joiners and basically just removing useless categories and cleaning it up. And then this next step here is really key, because in the data sets, if players were traded, it would create new rows for those players. So I had to use, and TOT, or total, was used for the players that was their aggregated values, basically. So I had to pull those out and push them into the right, so I could get the right values. And then below is where I had to pull out the players that I actually pulled out in the right-hand side. So you can kind of see that the outputs kind of match up to the players there. So that's when, after that, basically after that is where the two outputs go. So one goes off to create the rookies and the injured players, and then the other is to create the fantasy based formats. So in the next slide, so if you see, this point here is where the two processes from before get joined together, so that we're analyzing, or we're basically doing it for the whole data set. This is where I bring in, so this is projections for all players, because obviously I have to use projections if they're for players that weren't in last year's analysis. So as I said before, this is where they combine the two processes from before. And then again, this is where I remove the projected players from for the healthy players last year, so that we're only dealing with the rookies and the injured players. And then the next one here is, I actually reviewing it am not 100% sure why exactly it's there, because the duplicate feature kind of takes it out from before. But regardless, we still get the output at the end, so that's what matters. And then kind of writing it out to a separate sheet and not putting it back in the process was necessary, because there was really weird formatting with a lot of the values that was in this projection. So I actually just manually kind of sat out and fixed it up. Maybe I could do it with FME, but it seems like the value removal process was just a bit inconsistent across and fiddly. So just, this is how I did it. So then I brought that sheet that I just created that had just the rookies and the injury players, I bring back in here for this particular sheet. And then this is where I create the 3-point percentage based on how many threes that they had hit. So here is kind of where you see all the different values of made threes, and then it's a bit messy, but the relatively values go out into the right percentages. So it's kind of hard to see. So that's just the different percentages of all the different players. And what I kind of thought here was that, you know, if you're making more threes, you're probably a better shooter, because why would you want to be shooting a lot of threes if you're not very good at doing it? That was my thoughts. So that basically all gets brought back into a manager that you can see here at the top left. And I just included this because this is quite important for the next steps. So this, as I said, this is where you've got your rookie and injured players. And these junction points were really helpful throughout the whole process in just seamlessly combining data sets. So this is where we get from below, the clean data sets have been joined down here as well, but then we bring it in with the rookies and we join it here, and we can feed this into the points and to the category analysis. And then the previous one here is just how, like, is an identifier of where the healthy players are from last season as well. So that kind of goes off into a future analysis and kind of bypasses creating the draft board. And so this is the category leagues. Wow, this actually turned out really well, the screenshot. Basically, what we've got here is I've broken this up into 3 parts because it's a bit to look at. So this is where we actually create the stats that I want. So as I was saying before, with categories, it's not necessarily how the values that, or how much of one stat you put in, but how you rank towards compared to everyone else. So that's a really handy stat. So what I did is I found the rank calculator transformer in FME. It's a custom one, which is why it's green. So thank you, whoever out there who created it. And basically was able to feed these in and rank all the categories that are important or are measured to category leagues, and created the ranks. And yeah, basically that's what this whole block is. But FME had a bit of trouble processing 7, or I should say 10 rank calculators back to back. So I just split the process up down here and then up here, and then rejoined them with a feature joiner. So then the second part of what I did was created a fantasy value of, I basically added up everyone's rank of every category and then divided it by how many categories there are. So it basically gives someone's ability to, or they might be really good at scoring points or score a lot of rebounds, but they're really bad at everything else. So this fantasy value shows you who kind of contributes everywhere and what their overall value is. So then it kind of splits off from there. So the one that goes to the right here is just I then rank their fantasy rank. So that gives me a clear kind of draft. And then that goes off to the right and into the spreadsheets. But then below is basically what I'm going to show you later on, where, because the season that I'm analyzing was a very COVID affected year where a lot of people were out with isolation and that sort of thing. So I thought it would be interesting to see how that affected people's values, or how valuable they were to fantasy. So basically I had to imply a durability weighting. And this is where it had to be different from points, because I actually had to inverse the fractions. So it was actually 72 games, which is the total season, over how many they played, which, because with the fantasy rank up here, you actually want a lower value because you want to be ranked higher. So that's why I had to inverse the fractions, which is very easily done in FME. And then, yeah, created the weighting from that, which I then applied to creating a new attribute for basically just their fantasy value times multiplied by the durability weighting, which created the score, which then I ranked, and then fed into the feature joiner. So having basically combining it with this meant that it was with the players from last year. It means I could filter out the projected players from this analysis, and then just give you who played last year, because that's what I was after. So then it's the points league, and this has come out really badly. It's kind of frustrating, but that's fine. So the first kind of part here is selecting the countable stats. So I used an attribute manager to basically funnel out all the ones that I didn't want, and we're just left with the stats that we need. And I got rid of the null values so that the calculations aren't stuffing up throughout it. And then, yeah, basically you can see through here, it says like field goals attempted, free throws attempted. Those are all the adding up all the values or creating the values so that I can create my fantasy value, and then did the same thing down here with the other ones, and then joined it back up in the feature with a feature joiner just for processing time. And then that's where basically, yeah, that's where I came in for creating the fantasy point stat. So added up everything. And then the next part is, so that's the fantasy points is kind of where I come into it. And then from here is where we split them off. So, and we can do the durability analysis exactly the same as the category ones before. So going up is where you see basically just created the durability value, which is in this case the amount of games over 72. So it creates a declining, I guess, value, and then rank that. And then again from before, I feature join it, and so I can just take the left side, which removes all the projected players from before, which I then kind of filter out and join up in a process that I will describe to you right now. And then the bottom, which doesn't have the durability, obviously goes up to my draft board for that year. So this is where it joins in. So and where I create my analysis for if the player performance differs. So I join in the points and the category in the first stop right here. And then in the second is where basically I create the rank difference. So how they rank in categories versus how they rank in points. And basically we can see who had the biggest difference and potentially why, but we'll get to that in a sec. So this is where I started producing the spreadsheets and the draft board. So I'll just bring everything in to make it a bit clearer. So that you got your points, which is up the top, which is what this square is here. So I've basically just used sorters in this kind of bracket down here to get them in the right order for my draft board, which I actually realized I didn't need to do, because in the Excel spreadsheet, you can put in filters at the top anyway. So it was a bit pointless, but still would have been valuable if I didn't have the filters in the Excel spreadsheet. And yeah, the points one is the top, where I've used usage percentage by team to group players so that I can find undervalued players in teams that might not be, I guess, seen as great players, but will probably output a lot as a result. And then there's my general board at the top, which is just straight from the fantasy rank straight into the general board. And that's what I'd be using. And then I've got a second one here, which is the comparison spreadsheet, which I'm about to show you. So this is where basically that comparison from the previous slide goes straight into a sorter and then goes straight into the comparison. And these two below here are attribute filters that I had to use to get, because there was a few players that had game played as 0. And I think that comes from a formatting issue, but basically it's stuffed up because I had to use durability and games played as a value or a calculation. It kind of skewed it out. So there are key players missing from that, but it was a way that I could just get a clean draft board, or a clean analysis, I guess. And then, yeah, you've got your category down here too, which is, yes, basically structured the same as the points draft board, but for categories. So basically and analyzing the COVID affected, this is like essentially this the draft board, or this, not, sorry, it's not a draft board. This is the spreadsheet analysis that got spat out. So you can see who, basically I just did the top 25 players, who was the best players for the points league. So you can see that these are just pretty big numbers. Like if you know NBA, you know that Julius Randle basically puts out statistical categories in almost everything, and same with like a lot of these players as well. And then, but if you go over to the category league, it gets a bit different. So you see that there are some common names that you might have seen before, but it completely changes. And this is particularly when it comes into the COVID league, it comes into COVID affected leagues too. So someone like Michael Bridges, if you know NBA, he's definitely not going to be the most valuable player for you, but the fact that he played every single game, and you can see a lot of these players, like there's 72 games in the season, you know, quite high contribution, which is what's put them up there. But then you can compare that. So basically going from category, if you were in going from category leagues, and sorry, if you're going from point leagues and you then switched it to category, who does the best from going from points to category? So you can see someone like, well, you can just see how big of a rank changes that there are. So there's, I think, 460 players in the NBA. So, you know, quite a big swing. Some of these players are seeing going from points to category. And then obviously if you flip that, you see the players that do a whole lot better when it's when they're in a points league. So usually you get a lot of these guys. So like Russell Westbrook, as people will know, not a very efficient player. So you can see in points, he's the 18th best player, but for categories, he slips all the way down. And same with someone like Rudy Gobert, mainly because their shooting percentages are woeful. So if you then go, all right, well, who's my best picks? This is kind of what I was saying. So you'll notice that why was Julius Randle beating Damian Lillard for last year? Because he played more games. So because they were so close, the fact that he was able to play 4 more games meant that actually overall he's the better player, or was the more valuable pick last year. And you can kind of, yeah, I guess that kind of just translates to the rest. But same sort of thing. KD doesn't make a surprise that he was the number one, and because, you know, we saw how well he did last year as well, but he's nowhere near the top when it comes to the durability analysis, because he only played half the season, so he's not going to be anywhere close. So you can see a lot of these players like Paul George, CJ McCollum weren't really seen, Gordon Hayward, they weren't really seen because they'd played such little games. So the key issues is that, as I said before, there was missing games played with some of the ones that I had to take out in the attribute filter. So Nikola Jokic and Luka Doncic are quite notable for that, if you know who they are. And the stat sheet contained different details. So there was offensive rebounds missing, and usage percentage for rookies. So just some things I couldn't do, which you just have to keep in mind. And ways around this, I could probably manually edit the names for the players, and also just with the missing stats, you can just find more sheets to bring them in if I had the time to do it. But so a conclusion kind of from this is that there's hundreds of stats out there that you can't include, but with FME, if you know what you're doing, you can bring them in and kind of trim out your stat sheets pretty easily. And you know, you can kind of tinker along the process. You don't have to restart everything, which was really good if you've just made a mistake somewhere. And I can reuse this for next year when we redo another draft. So yeah, it's quite good for that. So kind of future plans is that I could create APIs with this as well, or look into that to connect into some sporting websites. So this could be a real-time thing, which would be really good for, say, when players get traded and that sort of thing. But I could also develop some, you know, probably use FME to determine a linear factor or a common value for the 3 points percentages based off threes, rather than just kind of assuming it like I did. But yeah, that's pretty much my presentation. Thank you for listening.